Hey friends, tonight we're diving into one of the least glamorous gigs of the Middle Ages. No, not the guy scooping dung off the streets, though he definitely deserves a documentary. We're talking about medieval assassins, the shadowy, knife-wielding, cloak-hugging figures of history who sound mysterious in theory. But in reality, their lives were a lot more miserable, filthy, and short-lived than any scroll or video game would ever admit. Forget parkour across castle walls and dramatic hooded exits into the mist. Real assassins dealt with tetanus, sewage, and betrayals that made soap opera characters look loyal. Before we slip into the shadows, though, do me a favor. If you enjoy this style of deep dives into the darker, colder, and more awkward corners of history, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Seriously, it's always wild to see who's lurking in the darkness of YouTube at 3 a.m. With us, now then, dim the lights, pull your cloak tighter, and sharpen your rusty dagger. Because surviving as a killer in the medieval world was less about glamour and more about how not to die from your own bad plan. Being an assassin in medieval times wasn't some grand honor bestowed by secret societies with cool Latin names and wax seals. It was more like, congratulations, you're desperate enough to risk being flayed alive for money. Welcome aboard. You didn't get benefits. You didn't get recognition. What you got was a stomach ulcer from stress, an infection from the rusty blade you probably made yourself, and the constant threat of being tortured into a confession that may or may not end with your body parts decorating a city gate. Let's start with the basics. Who even became an assassin? Spoiler, not the charming rogue type with a mysterious past and a soft spot for orphans. No, usually it was someone poor, outcast, and angry enough to take a suicide mission for coin. Sometimes a political enemy paid you, sometimes a crime boss, with delusions of grandeur, and sometimes a noble who didn't want to get his hands dirty, but was perfectly fine hiring someone who lived off boiled cabbage and rage. And the jobs? Rarely clean, rarely quick. A typical assassination involved sneaking into a heavily guarded manor, finding a specific person, and killing them silently without being seen, all while avoiding traps, guards, barking dogs, and nosy maids with excellent memories. If you think that sounds like a nightmare, it absolutely was. And if you failed? Well, let's just say medieval justice didn't believe in fair trials and light sentencing. If you got caught mid-job, dagger in hand, covered, in blood, possibly halfway through explaining, this isn't what it looks like, the punishment was almost always public execution. But not just any execution. Oh no. Assassins were treated like entertainment. You might be hanged, drawn, and quartered, maybe boiled alive if the judge had a flair for the dramatic, or tied to 4 horses and encouraged to explore 4 separate directions at once. Either way, nobody clapped for you, but even if you did succeed, you weren't showered in gold and whisked away to a secret fortress in the Alps. You were more likely handed a small bag of coins, told to disappear forever, and then immediately marked for death, so the person who hired you wouldn't risk being connected to the crime. See the problem? The only way to be a successful assassin in medieval times was to not be one, or at least not for long. The stress alone could crush your ribs. You couldn't stay in one town too long, couldn't use your real name, couldn't trust your own. Handler. Every alley might be the last thing you see. Every knock at the door could be a surprise confession extraction party, hosted by the King's Guard. And don't even get me started on gear. Movies love to show sleek blades and concealed poison rings, but real medieval assassins had whatever they could afford. A bent dagger, a sharpened bone, or if they were really lucky, a rusty crossbow with the accuracy of a drunk pigeon. And poisons? Those were mostly trial and error. You didn't know if your mixture would kill someone or just give them bad gas and a second wind. Yet somehow, some of them pulled it off, and not just once. Some assassins became legends, Ghosts whispered about in castle corridors and inked into letters sealed in wax and fear. But make no mistake, even the best of them rarely died in bed. And if they did, it was usually someone else's bed, someone else's blade, and someone else's idea of justice. In this world of loyalty, bought by coin, betrayal served with wine, and justice delivered via axe, the assassin's life wasn't noble. It wasn't romantic. It was muddy, brutal, and always ticking toward the end. So, yes, it sucked to be a medieval assassin. But trust me, that was just the beginning of the misery. Because things get much worse when we talk about where they hid, how they worked, and what the church had to say about your immortal soul after you slit a bishop's throat in a holy sanctuary. But we'll get there. For now, stay close. Keep your back to the wall, and don't trust anyone holding a mug with both hands. That's a classic dagger-concealing move. So, let's say you just assassinated a corrupt noble, snuck out of his manor without getting skewered by a guard, a spear, and are now quietly celebrating your incredible luck by not being dead yet. What's next? Hide. Immediately. Because in medieval times, once you killed someone important, every town crier within 3 counties would be yelling your name and vague descriptions like, probably looks suspicious, or walks funny. There were no security cameras, sure, but there were nosy neighbors, chatty innkeepers, and that one peasant who never blinked and always saw everything. Where did you hide if you were a medieval assassin? Not in some underground lair with velvet curtains and secret passageways. That's Hollywood nonsense. You hid where the fleas were thick and the hope was thin, haylofts, abandoned barns, monastery stables, and if things got truly dire, among the lepers. Yes, you might pretend to have a rotting face disease just to avoid actual rotting via execution. Urban areas were the worst. You couldn't exactly stroll into a city after an assassination and ask for a room with a view. You had to blend in, which was hard because blending in required not looking like you were actively running from justice, wearing something other than blood-splattered rags, smelling like you belonged, which usually meant like beer, onions, and existential dread. And don't think disguises were easy. There were no costume shops. You made do with what you could find. Old clothes from drying lines, stolen cloaks from drunks, maybe even a stolen priest robe if you felt particularly bold and unbothered by lightning strikes. But robes didn't stop people from noticing your twitchy eyes, or the fact that you had a dagger stuffed into your belt and kept checking exits like you were expecting a dragon to burst in. The safest option? Disappear into the wilderness, which sounds romantic until you realize the wilderness was mostly damp forests, packs of wolves, bandits who weren't picky about who they robbed, and a distinct lack of plumbing. You'd be cold, wet, miserable, and possibly full of mushrooms you weren't 100% sure were edible. Also, every sound became suspicious. A twig snaps, that's death. An owl hoots, death with feathers. Your own stomach growls, probably death again, food. You stole it, or begged for it, or ate whatever wasn't already half decayed. There were no ration bars, no protein shakes, just you, some stolen bread, and a turnip that tasted like regret. And here's the kicker. Even if you managed to hide, successfully for days, weeks, maybe even months, the paranoia never left. You always thought someone was watching. Always expected a rustle behind you to be a bounty hunter or a rival assassin, or just karma arriving on horseback. Because let's be honest, in medieval Europe, there weren't many people who lived long enough to retire from the murder business. It was more of a short-term hustle with very poor long-term benefits, and if you really ticked off someone powerful, like a baron, bishop, or especially a royal, they'd send more than just guards. They'd send trackers, hounds, informants, sometimes even witch hunters if they thought your vanishing act smelled a little too supernatural. You weren't just hunted, you were cursed, excommunicated, and occasionally declared an agent of the devil. Yes, that escalated quickly. Because when people couldn't understand how you got in, got the job done, and got out, they just assumed black magic. And next thing you know, someone's trying to burn your decoy corpse in a holy pyre. So, no, hiding wasn't peaceful. It was just the loudest kind of silence. The kind where even your thoughts sounded like footsteps. You slept with one eye open, ate with one hand on your blade, and every morning you woke up not to birdsong, but the harsh, ringing thought, how long until someone finds me? It wasn't freedom. It was an open-air prison, one where you were your own jailer, your own guard, and eventually your own executioner. And if you think the hiding was bad, wait until you learn what happened when the job went political. When kings whispered your name in fear, and popes demanded your soul on parchment. But we'll get there. Oh, we'll absolutely get there. If sneaking into a manor and vanishing into the woods wasn't hard enough, imagine what happened when the person you killed mattered. Not just to one family or one feuding noble, but to an entire country. Or, worse, to the church? Assassinate a merchant? You'd have a few guards after you, maybe a bounty on your head. Assassinate a bishop? Congratulations. You're now excommunicated, cursed, hunted by God, and possibly blamed for the next 5 years of bad weather. The medieval church didn't play. This was the era when a sneeze could be a sign of demonic possession, and you stabbing someone in a cassock meant you were practically the Antichrist. And it wasn't just the clergy who wanted you dead. The people did, because killing a religious figure wasn't murder. It was spiritual terrorism. Your name would be spat out in sermons. Town criers would denounce you in public squares. If they ever caught you, you wouldn't get a quick death. No, you'd get dragged in front of a crowd, tortured while the village choir sang Kyrie Ellison, and your last words would be drowned out by children throwing turnips. And if you thought being cursed was just words, think again. The church had rituals, real official ceremonies, to damn you. Public exorcisms, ringing of church bells to banish your soul, even placing a cursed candle upside down in a pool of holy water to symbolically drown you in eternal damnation. You were basically a walking horror story with a price on your head and a VIP seat in hell. But the real terror? Killing someone close to the throne. Assassins who tangled with royal families weren't just hunted, they became examples. The kind of examples they wrote into law, sang about in taverns, and retold to children who wouldn't eat their stew. Finish your peas, or you'll end up like the king killer who was hanged by his own intestines. Yes, that kind of bedtime story. Kings didn't just want you dead, they wanted you erased. You weren't given a name in history. You were the traitor, the coward, the shadow worm. Poets made fun of your screams. Your family was punished. Your dog might even be hanged. Not kidding, it's in the records. Medieval justice was unhinged. But here's the twist. Sometimes the crown hired you. That's right. You could be excommunicated 1 year and on the king's payroll the next, if he needed someone removed quietly. Because royalty had two faces, the one in public, praying in cathedrals and handing out coins, and the one in private, whispering to a hooded man in a back room with a bag of gold and a very specific name. You were a tool, a disposable one. When the king needed you, you were valuable. When he didn't, you were a liability, a ghost that knew too much and could ruin everything with a single, very inconvenient confession. So if you assassinated on behalf of the church or crown, you lived slightly longer. Slightly. But you were still always one scandal away from being cleansed for the good of the realm. You lived in a world where the sword didn't protect you. It just bought you time. And every time you saw a monk glare your way, every time you heard Latin chants in the distance, you wondered if someone had finally decided to redeem your soul with fire. It didn't matter if your reasons were noble. Maybe the person you killed deserved it. Maybe you believed in justice. Maybe you thought removing that one corrupt lord would make things better. It didn't matter, because once you crossed that line, the line between killer and legend, sinner and tool, man and monster, You didn't get to decide your own story anymore. The church wrote your fate in holy ink. The crown sealed it in wax. And you? You just kept running, hiding, stabbing, and hoping your name didn't end up carved into a public shame pillar next to a pig skull. So yes, being a medieval assassin sucked. And being a famous one? That just meant more people knew where to aim. But we're not done yet. Not even close. Because in Part 4, we head into the real nightmare fuel, the methods, what assassins actually did, and how unbelievably gruesome, stupid, and unpredictable it all could be. So you've agreed to be a medieval assassin. You've accepted. The coins, the target, and probably a handshake from a cloaked stranger who smells like sweat, secrets, and several poor life choices. Now comes the real problem. How do you actually kill someone without ending up dead yourself? Let's get one thing out of the way. Medieval assassinations were rarely elegant. They were messy, chaotic, and often alarmingly dumb. Movies loved to show poison vials and quick throat slits in candlelit rooms. Reality? More like slipping. In pig mud, stabbing the wrong guy, and getting chased by 5 angry villagers with rakes. Let's talk methods, shall we? First, the classic, the dagger in the dark. Every aspiring assassin had a blade, usually small, dull, and about as balanced as a drunk squirrel. Daggers weren't fancy heirlooms. They were hand-forged chunks of iron that rattled in your boot and sometimes bent if you hit bone at the wrong angle. You had one shot, one clean stab. And if your mark didn't die immediately, congratulations. Now you're in a full-blown sword fight with no sword. Then there was poison, the favorite of cowards and masterminds. Sounds smart, right? Sneak into the kitchen, drop some herbs into the stew, disappear into the shadows. Only problem. Half the time, poisons didn't work the way you expected. Medieval poisons were experimental at best. You mixed foxglove, belladonna, mold, or a suspicious mushroom you found behind a church. Sometimes it killed in minutes. Sometimes it just gave the target diarrhea and made him angry enough to kill you. And remember, peasants already had stomachs of steel from eating spoiled meat and questionable broth. If you tried to poison a noble, you had to get past the taster first. And if you poisoned both by accident, you just murdered someone rich and loyal. Double the bounty, double the execution. Another classic, falling objects. Chandeliers didn't exist, but rafters, loose bricks, and sacks of flour, all potential murder tools. If you dropped a stone block on someone's head from the right angle, it was quick and brutal. If you missed, you just looked like someone throwing rocks indoors and praying for a miracle. Strangulation? Only if you were patient, strong, and didn't mind being clawed at for several terrifying minutes while your target made noises that haunted your sleep for years. Disguise and infiltration? Risky. If you dressed as a servant, you'd better act like a servant. Because one wrong answer about where the firewood is stored, and suddenly you're surrounded by real servants with sharp implements and suspicion. There were even assassins who tried to get creative, setting fires and hoping the smoke would take the victim, or using trained animals, cats, snakes, birds, possibly lies, to sneak a distraction in. These rarely worked, but the attempts were legendary. One assassin reportedly tried to kill a noble by hiding in a wine barrel for 3 days. By the time the lid opened, he was starving, damp, and so dizzy he stabbed the guy's dog and passed out. Another climbed into a castle via the latrine shaft. That's right. He entered through the toilet. Imagine crawling through medieval sewage for a chance to murder someone, only to slip in the final room and accidentally alert a chambermaid with a scream. That sounded more like a dying goose. But perhaps the worst method of all, improvisation. Some assassins didn't plan. They just got close and winged it, tossed a plate, pushed someone off a balcony, head-butted a bishop mid-mass. It was less about skill and more about adrenaline-fueled madness. Sometimes it worked. Most times it ended with the assassin being dragged through the street by a horse named Regret, and after the kill, assuming you survived the stab, the guards, the screaming, the fleeing, you still had to disappear, which was somehow even harder. People would remember you. They'd remember your smell, your walk, your boots. Word of your crime would spread faster than fleas in a haystack. Suddenly, every man with a limp and a hood is being tackled by villagers. Some were innocent, many weren't. And if you were caught, torture until you confessed, gave up your employer, and then executed anyway. Because nobody likes a snitch, and even fewer like an assassin who talks. So yeah, the actual mechanics of killing someone in medieval times? Crude, ugly, often accidental, and always one breath away from disaster. Being an assassin didn't mean you were clever. It just meant you were willing to risk everything for a sack of coins, a promise of freedom, or the slim chance that you'd live long enough to regret it. And believe me, they always regretted it. But you know what came after all that bloodshed? After the job was done, the hiding failed, and the chase began? That's right, the capture. And that's where we're going next. So, you've been caught. Maybe a guard spotted you scaling a wall. Maybe a stable boy noticed your dagger didn't quite match the local blacksmith's style. Or maybe someone snitched for 5 copper coins and a slice of stale bread. However it happened, the jig is up. Now comes the real horror, medieval justice. And I'm using justice in the loosest possible sense. As in, the act of doing whatever causes the most pain while still calling it legal. Being an assassin meant you were automatically guilty of 2 things. Murder, obviously. Treason, because killing someone important almost always meant you accidentally offended the crown, the church, or someone's prized goose. And treason in the Middle Ages? That was the deluxe punishment package. First came the interrogation. You weren't asked politely in a candlelit room. You were dragged, sometimes literally, to a filthy dungeon, clapped in iron chains that hadn't been cleaned since the last poor soul screamed inside them, and left to sit in the dark until the torturer arrived like a joyful spider. And torturers? Oh, they were professionals. They had tools, a lot of tools, screws, ropes, racks, thumb screws, heated metal, pincers, hooks, vices, and sometimes just a stick, and the willingness to break your kneecaps while whistling. First they asked you questions, then they pulled your joints out of socket, then they asked again. Your job was to confess, not just to the murder. Anyone could admit to that. You needed to give names. Who hired you? Who helped you? Who else was involved? Who looked at you funny at the tavern? It didn't matter if the answer was no one. They'd keep going until you gave them someone. Sometimes they tortured you for sport, sometimes to send a message, sometimes because they hadn't had a good scream in weeks. And here's the twisted part. Even if you confessed, you were still getting executed. Confessing didn't save your life. It just gave them material for the public announcement. Because now we move to the grand finale, the execution. Executions were public. That's the whole point. It wasn't enough to kill you. They wanted everyone to watch. You might be hanged if they were feeling merciful. They usually weren't. Drawn and quartered if you really made someone important angry. That's where. They tie your limbs to horses and tell them to run in 4 different directions. And yes, it's exactly as awful as it sounds. Boiled alive if they were trying to make an example, flayed, burned, or broken on the wheel. If someone in power thought, you know what this needs? More screaming. The worst executions came with announcements. Town criers would read your name, your crime, and then list your sins. Sometimes they added insults, just to make sure your legacy was completely ruined. Imagine being tortured, then burned while someone says, this man, whose mother was a goat and whose breath could kill crops, did slay a nobleman on Tuesday last. Dignity. You left that behind in the dungeon, but it didn't stop there. Oh no. Your body became part of the punishment. Heads were stuck on spikes. Limbs were nailed to city gates. Your skull might become a warning sign, or your skin used to bind a justice book. Yes, seriously. And if you thought death ended the suffering, think again. The church would deny you burial. Your soul was condemned. Your name was blackened in every record. Your family might be shunned, fined, or worse, declared traitors by association. All because you took a job that paid slightly better than pig farming and slightly worse than just starving in peace. So, no, getting caught wasn't a conclusion. It was a production, a painful, theatrical, humiliating descent into legend. The kind whispered about in taverns while people glanced nervously at the door. The best-case scenario, you escaped. The worst-case scenario, you lived just long enough to hear the crowd cheering your death. And yet, there were some assassins who planned. For this, they had tricks, secrets, contingency plans, because the only thing worse than being captured was letting yourself be captured without a backup plan. And that's where we're headed next, into the strange, clever, and often ridiculous world of assassin escape tactics. So, you've been captured. You're in chains. Your ribs ache from a solid week of creative medieval hospitality. Your confession was screamed out 3 days ago and is probably halfway to the local bishop by now. You're dirty, starving, and mentally preparing for death by torch, blade, or something even less poetic. And yet, you're not done. Because real assassins, the ones who lived a little longer than average, didn't go quietly. They had plans, however crude, dumb, or downright disgusting those plans might have been. Let's talk about some of the real and rumored assassin escape tactics, the kind that probably smelled worse than they worked, but occasionally, just occasionally, actually succeeded. The dead man trick classic, gruesome. Occasionally effective, you fake death. Convince your captors you've already expired from wounds, fever, or possibly heartbreak. You slump in your cell, stop responding, slow your breathing, and let the stench of unwashed fear do the rest. Guards in the medieval world weren't exactly forensic experts. If you were limp, cold, and not currently biting them, they might assume the problem solved itself. You could then be disposed of, carted out with the other bodies, dumped into a pit, and if you were lucky, you moved after hitting the dirt instead of before, crawling out of a shallow grave under moonlight, covered in blood and lies. That's a successful Monday for a medieval assassin. The bribe and bolt method medieval jails were not known for their structural integrity or employee loyalty. If you had gold or knew someone who did, there was always one guard with gambling debt, family problems, or a chronic case of, I don't get paid enough for this. Bribe him with coin, promise him more, or convince him that letting you go will make his life longer. It often worked until it didn't. Of course, some assassins promised gold they didn't actually have, which meant if they got out, the guard was dead by morning. If they didn't get out, the guard just killed them first. Win-win? No. More like a gamble between betrayal and betrayal with interest. The bathroom wall shuffle in castles and dungeons built before modern plumbing. There were gaps, literal, physical gaps, between stone walls, under floorboards, behind crumbling bricks. If you were desperate, small, and had enough time, or rats to chew for you, you might dig your way out. One assassin allegedly escaped by wiggling through a latrine chute, a narrow, disgusting tunnel used for human waste. He covered himself in grease, held his breath, and slid right into the castle moat. Yes, he escaped. Yes, he smelled like doom for the rest of his life. Did people let him near food afterward? Probably not. But did he live? Absolutely. The pretend to convert scheme. This one required acting, serious, dramatic. I'm crying in the dungeon about my sins, acting. Some assassins pretended to have seen the light. They begged for a priest. They cried during confession. They claimed they'd been possessed by demons or misled by dark spirits or tricked by a rival. And occasionally it worked. The church, depending on how pious or gullible the cleric was, might intervene, ask for clemency, delay execution, let you out for spiritual recovery, and then, poof, you're gone. Out the door in borrowed robes, face down, walking slowly, until you reach the woods. Then it's full sprint, until you collapse in a ditch, laughing, weeping, and reeking of stolen incense. The set of fire and hope. Plan last resort. Maximum chaos. You start a fire, any fire, with a smuggled flint, a wooden cup, some straw. Anything. Then you scream, bang on the walls, and pray someone comes running. While the guards panic, trying to keep the building from burning down, you make your move, either in the smoke during the distraction or behind a screaming monk with a bucket. Sure, you might burn alive, or suffocate, or get caught 2 steps from the door. But when your other option is publicly disemboweled, you roll the dice. The fake the confession, fake the death, fake everything. Option this one's legendary. You confess. You give them names, but not real ones. Maybe some dead enemies. Maybe your employer's rival. You throw in enough truth to make it stick. Then you cooperate. You apologize. You help the investigation. You're rehabilitated. They delay your execution. They move you to a nicer prison, and then a bribe, a break-in, or a staged execution with a sack over your head and a silent dagger that doesn't actually kill you. And you're free. Not safe, but free. And if you ever show your face again, you're either a ghost or you're someone else entirely. Now, were these escape plans brilliant? No, they were desperate, sweaty, dirt-covered Hail Marys from people with nothing to lose. But sometimes they worked, because even in the darkest pits, with the odds stacked high and the flames licking the walls, assassins clung to survival the way a rat clings to a floating turd in the moat. Undignified, yes, but alive, and that's all that mattered. But there's something else, something bigger. See, some assassins didn't work alone. They were part of guilds, orders, or secret brotherhoods with their own rules, codes, and punishments. Some assassins worked alone, most didn't, because eventually even the most paranoid blade slinger realized something. It's hard to kill, hide, survive, and plan all by yourself, especially when you also have to steal food, bribe guards, and remember which name you're using this week. So, what do? Orrem. You join a guild, a cult, a brotherhood, or, if you're lucky, something that sounds noble, but is mostly just a murder club with fancy candles and better cloaks. These groups went by many names. Some were real. Some were whispered. Some were probably made up by paranoid nobles looking for someone to blame every time their cousin fell out of a window. But they all had one thing in common. They promised safety through secrecy and punishment through pain. Let's start with the most infamous of them all, the Hashashin. Yes, the real-life group that probably inspired 1,000 video games and edgy teenager usernames. The Hashashin were a sect of Nizari Ismailis in the 11th to 13th centuries. Based in the Middle East, they lived in fortresses built into mountains, trained in stealth, loyalty, and mind-bending discipline, and carried out political killings with surgical precision. And they were terrifying, not just because of their methods, which included infiltration, disguise, and assassinations in broad daylight in crowded public places, but because of their message. They didn't run after their kills. They waited to be captured because their deaths were part of the point. They were martyrs with daggers, symbols, warnings. "Don't cross us," their murders said, "or the next person to hand you wine will be holding a knife." But even outside the Middle East and medieval Europe, unofficial guilds started forming, small pockets of killers, not knights, not soldiers, outcasts, mercenaries, orphans, people who couldn't fit anywhere else but thrived in shadows. Some were hired by kings, some by merchants, some worked for causes, religions, revenge, or simply gold. They had rules, ironclad oaths. Break those oaths, and you didn't just get kicked out. You got hunted by your own brothers, the kind of family reunion that ends with a blade between the ribs. Initiations were brutal. Swear loyalty in blood, kill a target blindfolded, spend a night buried up to your neck while rats scurry nearby, all to prove one thing: you're not just a killer, you're a killer who believes. Guilds offered structure, safe houses, fences for stolen goods, alibis, training, maps, the things a solo assassin could never afford. They shared secrets, too, which guards could be bribed, which herbs actually worked as poison, which nobles were secretly hiring assassins through a friend of a cousin of a priest. But that structure came with chains. You didn't get to say no. If they ordered you to kill, you killed. If they told you to vanish, you vanished. If they told you to slit the throat of your closest friend because he spoke too loudly in a tavern, you sharpened your blade. Loyalty was everything until it wasn't, because in every guild, every order, every brotherhood, there was betrayal, rivalries, power struggles, quiet whispers of, "Why is he giving orders and not me?" Sooner or later, blood ran within the ranks. Some groups imploded, others split into factions. Some assassins went rogue, hunted by both enemies and their own former comrades. Now, were these escape plans brilliant? No. They were desperate, sweaty, dirt-covered Hail Marys from people with nothing to lose. But sometimes they worked. Because even in the darkest pits, with the odds stacked high and the flames licking the walls, assassins clung to survival, the way a rat clings to a floating turd in the moat. Undignified, yes, but alive, and that's all that mattered. But there's something else, something bigger. See, some assassins didn't work alone. They were part of guilds, orders, or secret brotherhoods with their own rules, codes, and punishments. If you think being a lone assassin was brutal, try doing it with a whole club of people who all want your head, and maybe your coin purse. Welcome to the world of medieval assassin guilds and brotherhoods, secret societies that trained killers, kept grudges, and had rules that were more like chains. These weren't your friendly neighborhood clubs with badges and bake sales. Nope. Assassin guilds were shadow governments operating in whispers, contracts, and blood, oaths. If you joined, you weren't just signing up for a job. You were pledging your life to a cause, or at least to a code that could get you sliced open if broken. Guilds provided training. And by training, I mean brutal tests of endurance, silence and patience that would make a Navy SEAL sweat bullets. You learned how to sneak, stab, poison, and disappear. But you also learned the harsh truth. Loyalty was conditional. Trust was a luxury. Your brothers might kill you for a better contract or just because you looked at them funny. Rules? Oh, they had rules. No killing guild members, officially. No working for enemies. And sometimes ignored. Never reveal the guild's secrets. Broken daily. Breaking a rule? You were marked for death. And not a quick death. A public, humiliating, painful one designed to remind everyone why rules existed. Sometimes the guild itself would execute you. An internal purge to protect secrets. Imagine being strangled by the same hands that taught you how to kill. Poetic, right? And guilds weren't all shadow and violence. They had politics, alliances with nobles, rival guilds, and corrupt officials. Sometimes they ran entire cities from the shadows, deciding who lived, who died, and who paid up. In some cases, they were more powerful than kings. Invisible kings of blood and fear. But guild life wasn't glamorous. Meetings were cold and tense. Training grounds were muddy and full of broken bones, and you were never sure if your neighbor was your friend or just waiting for the perfect moment to slit your throat. And let's not forget, betrayal was the ultimate weapon. Guilds trained assassins to be killers, but also master manipulators. A well-placed lie, a whispered secret, or a forged contract could topple kings, or your own leader. Some guilds had rituals, secret handshakes, hidden tattoos, or a special poison only they could use. Failure to uphold the ritual could mean exile, torture, or death. Being part of a guild was a life sentence. You were born in darkness, lived in shadows, and if you were lucky, died forgotten. Yet these guilds shaped history. They toppled regimes, ignited wars, and kept the balance of power teetering on a knife's edge. So, next time you hear about A medieval king mysteriously disappearing, or a noble found dead in his chambers, remember? Somewhere, a guild assassin is wiping the blade, counting coins, and planning their next move. And after guilds, the story only gets stranger. Because in Part 8, we explore the real wild cards, freelance assassins, double agents, and the dirty deals that didn't make it into the history books. Now, if assassin guilds were ruthless but organized, freelance assassins were the medieval version of feral cats with knives. These were the rogues, the rejects, the thanks but no thanks types who either left a guild, got kicked out, or never joined to begin with. They had no backup, no brotherhood, and no rules. Just a blade, a mission, and the kind of attitude that screamed, "I'm not dying for your code." Freelancers operated alone. They answered to no one, which sounds badass. Until you realize what that actually meant. No safe houses, no allies, no one to clean up the mess when things went wrong. And things always went wrong. A freelance assassin had to be part killer, part spy, part actor, part rat, and part magician. You didn't just kill. You lied, you charmed, you bribed, begged, seduced, blackmailed, forged, and fled. And when you finally did the job, you still had to chase your own payment, because if your employer decided not to pay, what were you going to do? File a complaint? Kill him? Spoiler. Yes, that's exactly what happened. A lot. Which brings us to the next level of mess. Double agents, oh yes. Because in a world of backstabbing, some people thought, you know what's better than betrayal? Double betrayal. These assassins worked both sides. They'd take a contract from one lord to kill another, and then go warn the target and offer to kill the first lord instead, for a slightly higher fee, of course. Now imagine that happening 5 times in 1 week. It did. Welcome to medieval politics. Everyone's stabbing everyone, and half of them are getting paid to switch sides while doing it. Some assassins even made a career out of playing both ends. They weren't hired to kill anyone at all, just to create fear, to make enemies think someone was after them. They'd spread rumors, leave threatening notes, kill a chicken, and toss it through a window. Anything to make a noble sleep with one eye open and a guard on every door. That fear, it was currency, and some assassins cashed in. But here's the dark side of freelancing. No one trusts you. Not clients, not rivals, not even peasants. You're a blade for hire. Your loyalty belongs to the highest bidder. And when the bidding war ends, you're left holding a bag of coin and the knowledge that someone is already planning to remove you from the game board. Because in this business, reputation is everything. Mess up a job, betray a client, leave too many witnesses, and soon your name is a curse. Guilds blacklist you, taverns close their doors. The last barkeep who gave you shelter ends up missing a tongue. And if you were too good, well, then the guilds came looking for you anyway, to kill you or recruit you. And both involved blood. So you had 2 choices. Stay small, stay invisible, and die poor, make waves, break rules, and die spectacularly. Either way, you die. And if you somehow didn't, if you lived long enough to get old in this profession, well, then you became something else entirely. Not a killer, not a freelancer, not a guild pawn. You became a legend. And that's where we're heading next. Some assassins die and vanish, buried in unmarked graves, remembered by no one, cursed only by their debtors. But a very rare few, they became something else. Not men, not murderers, but legends. You know the kind. The assassin who killed a king in his sleep and vanished into smoke. The faceless killer who walked through 100 guards and left nothing behind but a red feather. The woman who danced at court, kissed a prince, and he never woke up again. Were they real? Maybe. Probably not. But that didn't stop people from telling the stories, again and again, until they became gospel in every dark tavern and back alley in Europe. Let's start with the most famous name whispered in candlelit fear. The Grey Veil. No one knew his face, or her face, or if they even existed. But whenever a noble died mysteriously, throat cut with surgical precision, heart stabbed in a way that didn't spill blood. People said, "The gray veil has passed through." Some said he was once a monk. Others said she was a royal handmaiden. The only thing they agreed on? The killer wore a gray scarf, moved like mist, and never failed. Reality? Probably 4 different people who just really like scarves and poison. But the legend? Powerful enough that entire castles would lock down if someone saw a figure in gray near the gate. Fear is efficient. It does the work for you. Then there was Alira the Pale, a name so drenched in myth that she was believed to be undead. Some claimed she was a vampire. Others said she was born during an eclipse and raised by wolves. But the facts, what little there were, all pointed to a brilliant, ruthless killer who worked only at night, never spoke, and left silver coins over the eyes of her targets. Did she die? Maybe. Or maybe she just got old, changed names, and trained the next generation. Because that's how legends work. They survive by shifting, by becoming whoever people need them to be. One generation sees a killer, the next sees a symbol. The next sees a warning, and eventually the name is no longer a person. It's a threat. The church tried to erase them, declared their stories heresy, burned books, preached sermons. It didn't work. You can't erase a name etched in blood and fear. Kings feared these legends more than armies. Because you could. Bribe soldiers. You could fight battles. But how do you fight a ghost? One who walks through your palace walls and reminds you that your crown doesn't cover your throat. But the saddest part of all, most of them probably never existed. Oh, the killings were real. The corpses were very real. But the person? That was usually a mix of 5 different killers, 2 poets, and 1 drunk bard exaggerating for coin. That's how myths are born, out of chaos, out of fear, out of need. The world needed to believe in the perfect assassin, the one who could strike down tyrants, punish the wicked, balance the scales, a dark avenger with a blade instead of a conscience. And so they made one. Or many, or none. But here's the truth they don't tell you. Even the legends, the ones who may have actually lived, still died. Sometimes screaming, sometimes alone, sometimes forgotten. Because no matter how sharp the blade, time always cuts deeper. But there's one more thing we haven't talked about. The aftermath. What happens after the kill? Not just to the assassin, but to the world around them. Because one death can start a war. One silent blade can end a dynasty. And sometimes the cost of the kill is more than anyone can afford, because in this business, death isn't the end. It's just the beginning of another story. When an assassin's blade finds its mark, the world shifts. A king falls. Suddenly, nobles scramble like rats to fill the power vacuum. Alliances crumble overnight. Wars ignite in faraway lands because one throne is suddenly empty. Every kill sends ripples. A family mourns. But the enemy celebrates. A kingdom's borders change because the heir was too young, too weak, or too angry to hold the peace. The courtiers whisper, the priests pray, and the merchants prepare for chaos. But it's not just kingdoms and crowns. It's the small lives caught in the crossfire, the widow who never sees justice, the child who inherits a curse, the innocent burned because they wore the wrong sigil or shared the wrong name. Revenge festers, and revenge demands blood. So the cycle spins. On sometimes it's subtle, a whispered rumor, a poisoned chalice passed at a feast. Sometimes it's brutal, armies marching, cities burning, streets running red. The assassin might be gone, dead, hunted, or vanished. But their work echoes forever. And the legacy? It's not just about stories in taverns or legends etched in shadow. It's about what you leave behind, a name that haunts, a reputation that outlives flesh and bone, a warning carved into the minds of every would-be tyrant and every desperate rebel. And for some, the truly rare, the legacy becomes something more, not just fear, but change. Because sometimes a single death can topple a corrupt regime, spark a revolution, or save 1,000 lives by removing a monster. The assassin becomes a symbol. the silent hand that shapes history. But make no mistake, every legacy is stained with guilt, regret, and sacrifice, because murder isn't clean. It never was. It leaves scars on the soul of the killer, the victim, and everyone caught in between. So if you walk this path, if you choose to be the shadow that ends lives, remember this: the price is never paid in gold. It's paid in blood, in silence, in the stories whispered after you're gone. And if you live long enough, if you survive the betrayals, the hunts, and the ghosts of your own conscience, then maybe, just maybe, you won't be remembered as a killer. You'll be remembered as a legend. So that's the shadowy world behind every silent blade. The blood, the fear, the legends, and the legacy. A world where death changes everything, and where the stories live on long after the last breath. If you've enjoyed diving into this dark tale of assassins, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that cut deeper than the blade, and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Got a theory? A favorite assassin legend? Drop it in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay sharp, but keep your shadows close.